Tonight we are going to begin, there it is, with introducing the book of Isaiah. And heard someone say a long time ago, always remembered it, that a book properly introduced is half studied. And that's probably about the truth of the matter. We tend within the church just to skip over introductions. Mine will be a few weeks long and still won't be nearly as extensive as a lot. But do want to introduce it at least a little bit. First, looking at the man Isaiah himself. The meaning of his name literally is salvation of Jehovah. Or if you want the modern day, instead of Jehovah, it's Yahweh. But that's literally what his name means. His name was bearing the symbol of his mission, was symbolic of his mission. Carl, if you will, turn over to Isaiah 8 and verse 18 and read that. Isaiah 8 and verse 18. He's having trouble with his iPad.
Behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me are for signs and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts, which dwelleth in Mount Zion.
Okay. Notice, I, that would be Isaiah himself, and the children whom the Lord hath given me, which we'll mention them in a few minutes. He says, are for signs and wonders in Israel. His name meant something. It was symbolic of his mission. Thus, salvation of Jehovah. His name, Isaiah, actually is parallel to the name Joshua or the name Jesus. Both of those names mean Savior. And so this is a different way of saying that, but it's still dealing with that type of an idea. He is the salvation of Jehovah. He literally was the most renowned prophet in the Old Testament. He wrote the largest prophetic book as far as chapters is concerned. As far as words, there's another one that is larger. Anyone want to take a guess? Jeremiah. As far as words, is longer than Isaiah, but Isaiah has more chapters. Also, Isaiah is quoted more by New Testament writers than any other prophet. So if you're looking at who the or the New Testament writers look to, they look to a great extent to Isaiah. And when the New Testament writers mentioned a name of a prophet, not just saying a prophet or it is written or something along that line, but actually mention a specific name, he is quoted by name more than all of the other prophets combined. That shows how many times that he is mentioned as far as by name in the New Testament.
Would that be because he was considered the Messianic prophet? Most of his prophecy.
A great deal of his prophecy is dealing with the Messianic aspect of the coming Christ or Messiah, the establishment of the church, and many of those aspects, yes. And so they would quote him. But if you go back in the Psalms, a lot of those were as well. Some others maybe not nearly as much, but certainly Isaiah is one of those that is dealing specifically with that. He lived from, and again, considering the dates, and I hope you still have the sheet that I gave you, but 780 to 690 BC would be the time frame in which he lived. Contemporary prophets. So these are prophets that would be during the same time frame. Amos, Hosea, Joel, and Micah. And I'll mention at this point, since mentioning other prophets, when you're reading and studying the prophets, some of them we don't know when they prophesied. Some of them, you look at some of the dates of some of the prophets, and some of them are put in the 800s all the way into 600s. And that's why I say some of them we just really don't know. His background. He was probably a native of Jerusalem and probably a close relation with the king. Now, according to tradition, in introducing Isaiah, I'll mention several things about tradition, or the traditions about him. Some of these traditions you can't put too much stock in. Others seem to be sensible, put it that way. But according to tradition, he was the nephew of King Amaziah and the cousin of King Uzziah. And if you have that handout from last week, you'll see the kings there, and so you'll see how that relates to that time frame and period. He is the son of Amoz. Now, when we look at Amoz, his name means he shall strengthen, or good courage. The same ideas coming from the same name. He shall strengthen, or good courage. He was a family of some rank. Again, rabbinic tradition says that he was the brother of King Amaziah, thus making...
You mean Amos 1?
Yes, Amos. That's who we're talking about now. He would have been the brother of King Amaziah, and thus making Isaiah Amaziah's nephew. And would make Isaiah also the grandson of King Joash. If you look at that sheet again.
Is that the one that came to power when he was 7 years old?
I don't remember offhand. I don't remember offhand. So, and first cousin to Uzziah as a result. Being of royal blood, Amoz would be a man of the palace, have free access to the king, and that's the type of situation that Isaiah would have been brought up with. And thus Isaiah himself would have great access to the king. They would have been very familiar with each other and know each other and grown up together. So if you think back in relationship to some of the events that take place in relationship to Isaiah and the kings, you can understand maybe it does seem to harmonize with the aspect that he would have been very familiar with them, would have been able to go in and talk to them. Isaiah was married with at least 2 sons. He was married to the prophetess. That's what we know in Isaiah 8 and verse 3. And I went unto the prophetess, and she conceived and bare a son. Then said the Lord unto me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. Didn't I do well on that one? Years and years ago, before I moved here, I learned that one because I remembered a preacher talking about some people come to these names and get all confused and quit reading the Bible, and he mentioned Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So I learned his name. Now, a lot of the others I can't pronounce, but I did that one. The other son's name would be Shear-jashub. His name means a remnant shall return. Maher-shalal-hash-baz, on the other hand, his name means haste to the spoil, he hasteneth to pray. Now then, remember the verse that we read just a moment ago in Isaiah 8 and verse 18, where he says, behold, I and the children whom the Lord hath given me, well, that's Shear-jashub and Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So Isaiah and his 2 children, or sons, are for signs and for wonders in Israel from the Lord of hosts. And notice it's from the Lord of hosts. Go back to Isaiah 8 and verse 3. He then said the Lord to me, call his name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. So it was a name which the Lord gave to Isaiah's son as a message or a sign to Israel. His name, and thus you look at the name. It's amazing to me, and this is kind of as an aside, that so many in the denominational world want to claim that there's nothing in a name. They don't believe it to begin with, but that's the way in which they argue many times in relationship to the name of their church. And since they're not found in the Bible, well, there's nothing in a name. Well, God obviously didn't think that way, because he gave individuals specific names and here a specific name for a message to the people. So,
how many people are named Ahab, Jezebel, or Judas?
well, there's a lot of names that we will avoid as a result of what is associated with the name. And
I think there was only one MC. M-Z. I can't say his name.
oh, Mayor Shalahashbaz? M to Z. Okay, I understand finally. There's only one named Mayor Shalahashbaz. I wonder how long it took him to learn to spell his name. I think I would have shortened it. But obviously names are important, and they are to God. And here these three names, Isaiah and his two sons, their names are important because they were given by God as a sign to Israel. John the Baptist, Jesus. Why would God change Abram to Abraham? Jacob to Isaac? And you can just continue on. Names are important within the Bible. So, Isaiah was a well-educated man. He is noted for his vocabulary. A long time ago, I heard a psychologist talking. Might have been psychiatrist, one or the other. And they were talking about having to go in and evaluate an individual, basically on a very short time frame, just a few hours spent with them. And one of the things in which you can determine the intelligence of an individual is his vocabulary. Now then, that's certainly not the only thing, but that's an indication many times. A well-educated man will generally use a good vocabulary. Well, Isaiah is noted for his vocabulary. For example, Ezekiel. I'll bring Ezekiel up first. He uses 1,535 different words. Jeremiah, remember his, as far as word, his is longer than Isaiah. He uses 1,653 different words. Now we're talking about different words, not total words. The entirety of the Psalms, all 150 of them, and the Psalms had different writers during various times, but all of the Psalms only used 2,170 different words. Isaiah, on the other hand, by himself, uses 2,186 different words. Now then, again, go back to that intelligence in relationship to words. Well-educated person uses a variety, numerous words.
I'd say that most of the people, common people in this country, their vocabulary is limited.
Their vocabulary is very limited. Most people in our nation, our vocabulary is very limited. You do not see people using a variety of words. you see that less and less and less in our society. You go back 100 years, and the vocabulary would have been a whole lot better, a whole lot more words being used. Today, very few.
Abraham had a pretty good vocabulary. Not Abraham, but Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln. Okay.
Chaplain told us that one time, and we all had to go see the chaplain, and he gave us a lecture that that's what he was talking about, our vocabulary, is that he used the word hell. So you take that one word, and it's either hot, that's that word, cold, hard, soft, high, low. It's one word.
Right.
So now you see what you've done to your vocabulary.
We have butchered our vocabulary within our nation today. I'm going to stay away from getting off into a lot of illustrations, but we are a vocabulary poor people. In writing, the more you have to write, the more vocabulary you need to express your thoughts. And I know that from my standpoint, as I'm writing, a lot of times I will use a thesaurus in order to help my writing. Now then, if you ask a lot of the younger generation today, what is a thesaurus? You're right, they don't know what it is. They think it's a dinosaur. They just might. But, of course, a thesaurus gives you synonyms and antonyms, which a lot of young people wouldn't know what those meant. But the use of words, to go back to that, in order to express a correct idea, you need a specific word. That's why a lot of times we are confused, for example, when we read or try and read legal documents. They're using specific words to express a specific idea. And we, many times, don't know the legal definition of those words, and thus it's a lot of gibberish to us, isn't it?
Well, you don't have to use as many words in today's conversation. So like here, when I'm sending something, if I put down one word, it put the next one that I said before. So you don't get to concentrate on too many words.
Well, to a certain extent, you can't use too much. Our vocabulary becomes limited because we converse with people and we know that they don't have a lot of people don't have a good vocabulary, and so we use words in a very loose way. But that goes back to Isaiah being well educated. The number of words different words that he uses in his book.
Is he the greatest amount of words in the whole Bible?
As far as variety, I would say probably so, but I don't know specifically. Some of the comments regarding Isaiah also express the idea of his being well educated. And I didn't write down who these quotes are from, but various ones have said His is a masterpiece of Hebrew literature. Another one said, for versatility of expression and brilliance of imagery, Isaiah has no superior. Another stated that he was a perfect artist of words. Another said he's the St. Paul of the Old Testament. Now then, just to stop for that, in regards to that one, Paul was a very well-educated person, wasn't he? He sat at the feet of one of the greatest teachers, some say the greatest teacher of the Jews ever, Gamaliel. And thus he was a well-educated man. So to say that Isaiah is the St. Paul of the Old Testament is saying a great deal. Another stated that he is the king of all prophets. And again, that's trying to express the greatness of his expressions, his language, the beauty of speech that he has. Another said he is the universal prophet of all Israel. Never a prophet like Isaiah. So that's some of the comments in relationship to Isaiah and regarding him, to show his greatness, well-educated, his greatness of speech and language.
He was quite apparently sincere and dedicated, because
I would say all of the prophets were sincere and dedicated.
the reason I said that is he was reputed to have been Solomon too.
Well, we're going to get to that as well. In fact, that's the next point that I was going to make. And so, according to the Talmudic tradition, and again, when I say this is according to the Talmud, the tradition of the Talmud, you can't give a great deal of credence to it, even though there are some things that might sound plausible. But it states that when he was 90 years old, he resisted Manasseh's idolatrous decrees publicly. He was thus seized because of that, fastened between two planks, and sawn asunder. Now again, this is according to tradition. The Jewish Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud, states emphatically that Manasseh slew Isaiah. So they just say that, stated as a fact that Manasseh slew Isaiah. Justin Martyr, who wrote in 180-150, in his controversial dialogue with Trypho, reproached the Jews with the accusation concerning Isaiah, whom he sawn asunder with a wooden saw. The possible biblical reference would be in Hebrews 11 and verse 37, where he's talking about different ones. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented, and on he goes. But that phrase, they were sawn asunder, is oftentimes associated with, thus, Isaiah, because that is, according to tradition, how he died. At Manasseh's hand, because he withstood Manasseh bringing in the idolatry. that Manasseh brought in. He did so publicly, and so there's Manasseh seizing him and cutting him in two using a wooden saw.
He'd been in a pretty elderly age.
According to tradition, 90 years old. So yes, I don't think anyone here is 90 years old yet. Got a few years to go yet, Bill. So, yes, he would have been an older man at that point in time in his life.
Like this, what I read, he had retired. You could do that as a prophet at this time. You didn't hear much out of him back when he got up and was older.
That.
That's what I read.
Well, as he gets older, you don't hear as much from him as far as his writing or is concerned, as to whether his, from a oral aspect of his prophecies, he might have still been very active, but as far as writing, we don't really have much record of that. So that part would be true. Okay. His occupation. Of course, from what we've already seen, number one, he's a prophet. Number two, he would have been in the royal lineage, among the royalty. So that aspect and that occupation, we would say. His character. He was one who was bold, courageous, and if y'all can read that, your eyes are pretty good. I didn't, actually I messed up on that slide a little bit. He was bold, courageous, he was uncompromising, he denounced sins in the strongest terms possible. That was Isaiah. But in saying that, you could almost reproduce that in relationship to every one of the prophets, couldn't you? Bold, courageous, uncompromising, denouncing sins in the strongest of terms. You can say that about all the prophets, can't you? That's the whole point. Should be able to say that about all of us today.
That's what Jude was writing about.
I would agree. Jude was writing about that in no uncertain terms. We should all be like that. And those types of terms should be characteristic of every one of us. Sadly, it's not, is it? Not in relationship to a lot of Christians. Yet, even though he was bold, courageous, uncompromising, he was yet tender and compassionate. I think that is also characteristic of the majority, if not all, of the prophets. You have men who outwardly, because of the call that they have to denounce sin, to call the people back to repentance, yet inwardly they were generally tender and compassionate. And so you would say that a lot of people would not necessarily recognize the tenderness and compassion that they have even though, and all that they would see is the bold, courageous denouncing sins. They would see that, even though they wouldn't see the tender, compassionate person that the prophet was.
He always mixed his with, he would condemn them harshly for their sin and all, but he was always, in the end, he would get soft and assure them that this is not the end. There's still going to be some light at the end of the tunnel, I guess.
That's a good way to put it. He was always giving the light at the end of the tunnel. There's always hope that's there. And that goes back to the messianic nature of his work. That he was, you're going to be destroyed. And even tells them, don't fight against it, the things. But even though you're going to be destroyed, here's a Messiah that God's going to send. And that there's going to be a Savior that's there. He was also, and again, you could say this with pretty much all of the prophets, deeply spiritual and reverent. There is a reverent aspect of all of the prophets, but you see that in relationship to Isaiah and his attitude, his nature, his character. So all of these are aspects of his character that are important. His call to be a prophet. And in regards to this, the prophetic office is not a hereditary office. In other words, simply because your dad was a prophet doesn't mean that you'll be a prophet. And in order to be a prophet, your dad does not have to be a prophet. Now, with the priestly office, it was hereditary. You had to be of the tribe of Levi. And in order to be high priest, you had to be a direct descendant of Aaron. Thus, it was based totally upon heredity. That's why when Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70, all of the records, the genealogical records, were destroyed at that time. Try and find someone who is a Jew that can prove it today. Not a one of them can. Try and find someone of the priestly office. Well, you can't do that. Why? Because all of those records were destroyed in AD 70. So, in doing so, it wipes out Judaism as far as a religion. There is no way that you can have Judaism as set forth within the pages of the Old Testament. There's no way you can have it since AD 70. Because it depends upon the priestly office going in and making sacrifices for the people. And to be a member of that priestly office, you had to be of the tribe of Levi, but nobody can prove they're from the tribe of Levi today. It was totally hereditary. Prophetic office wasn't like that, though. Wasn't dependent upon anyone else in relationship to your family. So that's the way in which it worked.
What it brought about the distinction between Judaism and Christianity. Up until then, in AD 70, it was a sect.
They consider Jews consider it, and Romans consider it a sect of Judaism. But with AD 70, that took away that aspect. And while Israel, or the leaders of Israel, recognized even before AD 70 that Christianity was something different and distinct, even in relationship to Paul's trials in the book of Acts. He was accused of being a ringleader of the sect of the Jews. They recognized it even at that time frame, that it was a sect of Judaism. They didn't recognize it was totally separate and distinct. But in relationship to the priestly office, oftentimes the priests were as wicked as, if not more wicked, than the people in general. And you could, in relationship to that, a lot of people that are raised in the church are more wicked than those in the world. Shouldn't be, but we're talking about from a realistic standpoint. Priests should not have been wicked, but from a realistic standpoint, they were. And they were, to a great extent, the leaders in the apostasy many times. But yet they still were priests because why? Heritage. They inherited the work, the office.
In some cases, they took part in persecution, too.
Well, that's being as wicked as people and leading in it and persecuting the prophets. Prophets, on the other hand, received a direct call from God. God called them to the prophetic office. They came from various vocations. You had those of royal blood, like Isaiah. Daniel was also royal blood. So was Zephaniah. They were of royal blood. They were born in that kingly aspect, or with the kings, was raised in that aspect. So some of them were priests. Jeremiah was a priest, as was Ezekiel, and probably Zechariah was a priest. So they held both offices, a priestly office and the office of a prophet. Amos was a sheep herder of sheep. The majority of the prophets, though, we just don't know as far as their occupation. But Isaiah would have been among those who were of royal blood. So we'll stop there, and Lord willing, next week we'll start looking at actually the Isaiah's call to the prophetic office.